Welcome to Sanity, a podcast by the New York Sun. My name is A.R. Hoffman, and every week I'm joined by my co-host, Rebecca Sugar, as we try to make sense of the nonsense and bring a little sanity to your experience of the news.
So we like to start every podcast with a quote about sanity. And this one comes from the great 21st century philosopher and poet and boy band member Lance Bass of NSYNC fame. Do you remember NSYNC? You're old enough?
How could I ever forget?
Okay. Well, he said, "You've got to have a sense of humor to keep your sanity." Short but sweet and true. And I found myself this week, you probably did too, like laughing, but maybe nervously every time something happened. So just to give a quick rundown of what we're going to cover today, our top story is going to be President Trump's address to Congress. The Make It Make Sense segment, I'm going to use the opportunity to ply Ari with questions about the recent SCOTUS ruling, which is going to have effect on DOGE activity. So I'm really anxious for that one. Our tipping point segment will be about President Zelensky's infamous visit to the Oval Office and his maybe equally infamous apology letter maybe, to President Trump, and a little bit about Hamas and the Shalom Hamas moment that we experienced. Hello and goodbye. And then, of course, we're going to do our sunburns. And I just want to remind everybody that this Sunday, you should be looking for the Sanity interview, which will be with Naomi Schaefer-Riley, a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, who will be talking to us about the foster care system in America and offering Secretary Kennedy of Health and Human Services some pointers on how he can make that system better. So with that, Ari, let's start with the top story. And what did you think of President Trump's address?
Sure. It was, for all effect and purposes, a State of the Union. Through some arcane rules, we don't call a president's first address a State of the Union. The two big spectacles on TV this week were the Oscars and this address. And I think it's fair to say that this address was more entertaining.
I didn't watch the Oscars, but I'll take your word for it.
So maybe we'll do an Oscars breakout. But the first thing to say is this was the longest such address recorded. But far more entertaining, I'd say, than other stem winders like President Clinton's famous laundry list State of the Unions, where he just kind of drawled on in that Arkansas drawl interminably. No
offense to Arkansanians.
No. We hope you keep listening. Yeah. But President Trump is a showman. It's his first kind of principle, I think, and he's really good at it. He's really good at, and we'll get to the substance, but he's really good at generating memorable moments. He has an intuitive understanding of television, of how to make a mark, how to stick, right. And he's almost like the producer of his own television show.
Weren't you Googling? I was Googling, what's a sedentary migrant? I mean, that was such a great, funny moment.
Right. Or where is Lesotho? I mean, not to brag, but I do know where Lesotho is.
Oh, you have to show me later.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's one of the two smaller countries right near South Africa.
Oh, good to know.
But yeah, I mean, I think to move on maybe a little bit to the substance of it, although with Trump, substance and style are always connected. I think I keep coming back to the fact that, he's picked fights that he knows he can win and that the American people are largely with him on, right? The famous thing that you're starting to hear a lot is, well, that's an 80-20 issue. Mm-hmm. And he's good at fronting the 80-20 issues.
Yes, absolutely. And which would lead one to ask, why do the Democrats keep picking the 20 on that 80-20? It's shocking, right?
It's shocking.
What did you make of their response?
I mean, going in, I was talking to someone on the phone, and I just said it would be better just to do nothing. Yes. For the Democrats. Sit this one out. Mm-hmm. Instead, we had sort of a hodgepodge of reactions. We had Al Green is sort of heckling. Mm-hmm. That was a sort of Marjorie Taylor Greene, cover band act, I guess. We had those ridiculous paddles.
Yeah, like a Sotheby's auction. They were bidding on Mar-a-Lago or something. It was weird.
I mean, whoever uses those paddles, right? Yeah. What was that? We had we had people walk out, which I guess conceivably could be a powerful protest, except you couldn't see them walk out when you were watching on television. So, it's a party in disarray. It's a party that doesn't get style, doesn't get optics, and is really at a loss. I'm just a little bit baffled why Hakeem Jeffries, let's say, who I think is a reasonably savvy politician. You don't rise to where he has without being one. There was no game plan.
Yeah,
there was no sense of a coordinated effort.
I'm going to be a little more critical even than that and say that that display was so unbelievable, and they're so on the 20 out of the 80-20 that you have to wonder what could they be thinking. And a lot of people have talked about this for a while now since Trump's election. Why do they keep choosing these vastly unpopular issues to dig in on and make themselves look worse? And as I watched it, I thought maybe it's because we're not looking at the Democratic Party anymore. These aren't Democrats anymore. These are sort of kleptocratic semi-socialists who've taken over the host, and there are no Joe Liebermans anymore. And so that particular group of people with those ideologies, of course, they're going to be resistant to peace as opposed to war, or to saving American taxpayer dollars, because they get rich off of many of the programs that DOJ is exposing and off of war. And of course, they're not going to clap for that poor girl who was pummeled by a man pretending to be a woman on her sports team, because they want to undermine the foundations of American society. They're Marxists. They're semi-socialists. Not everyone, but the vibe of the entire party has shifted, and I don't think we're looking at Democrats anymore. And which is why I think my sort of more liberal friends are not defending this or much of what they've seen lately, because this isn't their team. And it's, invasion of the body snatchers. It looks like it has all the resemblance of the Democratic Party, but they have none of the soul and the spirit anymore. It's another thing entirely.
Well, that's definitely something to keep an eye on, is that sort of evolution or devolution. I think if you're a Democrat now who sort of wants to position yourself effectively, Gavin Newsom 1A, you're now running against the Democratic Party, and you're trying to distance yourself from it. And I think that's
as
also,
of 5 minutes ago, but yes.
Right, as of by the time we started this broadcast.
Yes.
But Trump's strength is that he is an outsider, and I think especially when you see sort of, as you said, this sort of climate in Congress, that's a very effective contrast. Now, the president's always going to have a bully pulpit, and a lot of Trump said is kind of Trumpy stuff, but I think this, picking the right fights, presenting himself as common sense. There are a couple of lines that stood out as a guardian of common sense. A couple of lines stood out to me. One was, to tighten the border, you didn't need new laws, you needed a new president.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the kind of law that
great.
As a speechwriter, wow,
Yeah.
Simple, to the point, and true.
Yep.
And true. And the other was when he said, the breaking of the fourth wall, when he said to Democrats, you're not going to cheer for anything I say anyway.
That was just strategically brilliant.
Brilliant, right? It called out the charade, right?
We just called Donald Trump brilliant. We want everyone to hear that.
It was a brilliant maneuver, and it sort of highlighted what most folks already know, is that this is all partisan, it's all scripted, but by calling attention to it, he kind of breaks through it.
Yeah. I also was struck by the sort of nature of the entire speech and his entire approach. He's a builder. And this whole speech was about building things, from, golden domes to ships, which is something we're going to discuss on a future podcast. But even when he was talking to the individual guests that he invited, he was always taking the tragedy that they faced and then building something onto it, right? The nature preserve for Jocelyn, who was killed by an illegal migrant, or building a future at West Point for a young man whose dream it was to. There was something about the entire speech that just was imbued with this sense of America as a place that builds things. And I think he's uniquely positioned to speak that way because of his real estate background and because of his tendency to make everything so grand and grandiose. Even if he can't deliver on what he's actually promising, the spirit of building is very familiar to Americans.
Yeah, I think that's right. I also think that he gets that these performances are not really about substance or policy. I remember growing up, we'd be watching at home and be waiting, what would the president say about Israel? What would they say about this issue? And you'd kind of be waiting for that section. And he basically was just sort of, the Middle East is a tough place, right? There's not, and I think that there's a savvy to that too, of understanding that what are people looking for, what's going to sort of make an impact, a sort of sense of dramatic irony with the Ukraine stuff and sort of breaking news almost. Here's a scoop.
Yeah.
So I thought it was a very effective performance. I don't know how many people it will persuade, but I think the contrast with Democrats was a very effective one for the president.
Yeah, I think maybe more than people who would be persuaded by President Trump's positive performance, or and I think the polls suggest, even CNN polls, that most people liked what they saw generally, but I think more than that impact is the negative impact, what this has done to the Democrats and the Democratic Party. They're feeling it, they know it, and some of them are doubling down on it, which is even more ridiculous and sort of absurd. And I'm sure Hakeem Jeffries is pulling his hair out over it, but that's their choice, and we'll see. Do you think this is going to have long-term negative effects on the Dems? I mean,
the Democrats have to really figure out what they're doing. I mean, remember, after it was Bush won re-election, Pelosi at 20 or younger Pelosi, and agree or disagree with her, at her peak, she was a formidable tactician, sort of really got everyone in line. Yeah. And within 2.5 years, they had the presidency and a huge majority in the House. So, politics is not a forever game. But right. I think there's a real opportunity here, and you see it with with opportunists like Newsom and others now. There's an opportunity here to move to the middle.
Yeah.
There's an opportunity to move to where people are, out of the white hot glare of a campaign season.
Yeah.
And I just don't know if they're seizing that moment.
Yeah. Let's move to make it make sense.
Sure. And we sometimes feel like these legal battles are you might feel like you should get law school credit just from listening to us. So, but we'll try to keep it high level and big picture.
Yeah.
And the big story this week was the Supreme Court intervening to say that President Trump's effort to sort of cancel $2 billion in payments to various aid organizations and projects that had already been for work already completed was unconstitutional. Now, this isn't a final order. It's sort of a temporary order. We're in this moment now of temporary orders where things are happening fast and furiously. Courts are saying, well, wait, we think we have an idea of where the state of play is now, but we need more time to think about it. So all of these are now temporary orders largely, but it was sort of an incredible temporary order because it split the court 5-4. Now remember, this is a conservative court right. by a 6-3 majority. So 5-4, you need defections to the other side, and you had two big ones: Chief Justice Roberts and Justice Amy Coney Barrett, and you had a really remarkable dissent, which is unusual in these interim brief orders, where Justice Alito said, "I'm stunned."
Yes.
By this decision.
Yeah.
So we're gearing up for a battle royale over presidential spending power. Now, this was a little bit...
Wait, I want to pause you on that.
Sure.
That's an important point. He was stunned. I think I read, and I want you to explain this, that he was stunned specifically by the idea that the Supreme Court just basically announced that a district court could make law for the entire nation. And we talked about that in our Sanity interview with Jed Rubenfeld. That was particularly the piece that stunned him.
Sure.
Not the spending piece, but what this sets up for, forum shopping and the idea of the power of the district court federally. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, he thought that this district court judge was out of line, and that to make that decision, right, when you're making these interim decisions, a big part of your calculation is, how do I think this case is going to go eventually? And this judge said, I think the challenge to Trump here has a pretty good shot of winning, and so I'm going to stop it now. And Alito just totally rejected that. I think you're absolutely right, Becca, behind that sort of stunnedness was a broader argument about presidential power, and that one district judge, and we've seen this surface in different ways, should not have the ability to limit how the executive branch and how the president can exercise his authority and exercise. Now, this was complicated because Congress had allocated this spending, right? So Trump is going to continue to run up against a wall, and that wall is going to be especially thick when Congress has already acted, because then what you have is not just a sort of debate within one branch, but a debate between branches of government.
I want to get to the spending, but I just want to nail down that part of what we were just discussing first, because I still don't think I fully understand. Does this SCOTUS ruling then mean that in future cases, there'll be a better argument for district court judges to have their rulings affect the entire country? Is that now the way it is in the United States because of this ruling? Did this move that ball forward significantly?
Yeah, and with the case of this special prosecutor named Dellinger, who's become almost sort of like a mascot for these kinds of challenges. You have district court rulings, you have circuit court rulings, panels, all of these different things. I mean, I think the tension of sort of the called the national injunction, right, where one judge can issue a ruling for the entirety of the country is something that's coming under increasing scrutiny, especially because a lot of these cases are going to happen in the District of Columbia because that's where the government is. And so you'd want to look at, okay, what are the ideological makeups of those courts? I don't know the numbers off the top of my hand, but historically, at least, the D.C. Circuit has been a pretty liberal body, and so it's favorable terrain historically. The D.C. federal courts have been historical terrain for Democrats.
Were you surprised at the defections of the two conservatives on the court?
I wasn't shocked. I think these are two within the court's conservative blocks. These are what passes for swing votes, right? It used to be that a swing vote could really swing. You'd have a swing vote, Anthony Kennedy, even a bit Souter, where you could, swing on a big issue back and forth. We don't really have that anymore, but just saying a judge is conservative doesn't tell you a lot, right? The difference between a Coney Barrett and a Roberts and an Alito and Thomas is pretty large.
Yes.
Right. So I think sometimes there's this expectation of lockstep voting, or that the court's so conservative, there's no drama. We know things in advance. We really don't.
Is the same true of the liberal, air quote judges?
Less so. I think the distance, let's say, from a Sotomayor to a Jackson is much smaller.
It's interesting
It's interesting, and it's worth thinking out loud why. One argument would be that a minority is always going to be tighter because they don't have that sort of power to make a decision, so they kind of stick together like a kind of, like a little rump, part of the bench. The other would be to say that there actually is more diversity of thought in terms of the conservative wing of the court. But I also think it's sort of the responsibility of governing, right? The Chief Roberts is in charge of the court as a whole, and so his responsibility is not just to the people he agrees with. It's to a broader sort of, to the U.S. justice system as a whole.
He's said that so many times in the past.
He says that to the point that it almost is annoying. But I also think the court has not hesitated to rule against Trump before, and I think. I think if again, with picking the right battles, I think there's enough skepticism to some of Trump's more expansive claims that that it's not a foregone conclusion that the Supreme Court's going to rubber stamp whatever he does.
Now I want to ask you about the actual spending, the $2 billion that was allocated to this agency. They actually performed the tasks, the work. And so does that matter in terms of thinking going forward about how these cases will go? If the next agency to sue has contracted and Congress has assigned the money, but they have not yet performed the work, does Trump have a better case?
I think so. I mean, I think this was a case that was particularly problematic for Trump because of that posture that is already. And I think most people would understand, if you want to get a sandwich for lunch and the sandwich is already made,
Yes.
I mean, you kind of have to pay for your sandwich.
Yes.
And Alito said that. I mean, Alito said there are contract issues here.
Yeah.
What he objected to was the breadth of the ruling, right? That the idea that the president doesn't have the authority to review this at all, as opposed to saying, well, he might, but you'd have to go case by case. I mean, was this money spent? Where does the contract sit?
Right. Well, that raises the question, do you think that this ruling will impact DOJ's approach? Will they take the scalpel now instead of the sledgehammer so they lose fewer cases? Or do you think they're just going to go all guns blazing as they have been so far?
Yeah, I mean, I think the real issue here is that, and this is the bedrock issue, is that the Constitution assigns to Congress the power to spend money. Now, the president has discretion maybe in how it's done, depending on the different agency or whatever. But at some point, DOJ is going to run into that. And that was the case here. I mean, this money had been allocated by Congress. And it becomes sort of very difficult then to say that the president has the ability to cancel it. But, what this interim decision indicates is there are at least 4 justices on the court who are open, open to the argument that the president has control in a significant way over the spending even of congressionally allotted funds.
Right. And there's some politics and optics to this too. And even if you lose, you might win if some of these cases just become public. And even if the Trump administration is forced to fund them, if the American public learns more about how the money is being spent, it's just not good for the potential of those agencies to get funded in the future.
Yeah, and I think there's one. I think the best argument for DOJ would be to say, well, okay, I mean, even if it loses a bunch of cases and maybe it saves the taxpayer half X instead of X, that's still a lot more than otherwise would have been saved.
And it's
right?
our half X. It's not theirs to take.
Right.
Onward to tipping point.
Tipping point. Yeah, actually, I'd say the third, the most entertaining spectacle, I'd say, of the week, or riveting spectacle, was the Oval Office meeting with President Zelensky. So why don't you go first and tell us what you thought?
Well, look, I had an initial reaction to it, which was that I felt that, and I watched the whole thing actually in real time, and I thought that Zelensky started that fight, so to speak. And then I would listen to a lot of podcasts and a lot of people, and there's, a lot of opinions about it. And I was listening to the commentary podcast with John Podhoretz, whom I know and I respect and I disagree with on most things having to do with Trump.
We're friends of the commentary podcast.
Yes. Yeah. But he's smart and insightful, and I listened to him, and he said something that I thought was so interesting. He said, I watched it, he watched it, and he couldn't imagine anybody watching that same thing and not seeing that J.D. Vance was the culprit. And so I went back and watched it again, because when John Podhoretz says something, I do listen. But I watched it again, and I only doubled down on my initial feeling about it. And I just thought maybe it doesn't even matter who picked the fight. What I really think is that we're dealing with reality and practical matters versus a person's wish list. And President Zelensky really wanted to hear we're on your team, you're the good guy, Russia's the bad guy. Donald Trump did not want to say that. I don't think because he's a Russian agent. I think because that's part of his negotiating tactic, like it or dislike it, approve or disapprove. And when Zelensky didn't get what he wanted, I thought he threw a temper tantrum. And I thought it was not just bad behavior. I'm not his mother. But I did think that it was bad strategy. And I don't think that one would have gotten to that moment in the Oval Office without having talked about these issues before. We now know that they did several times. So he didn't have to do this and do it in front of the American people, but he chose to. And he needs America. And now we see in the events that have occurred since that he knows he needs America. Britain's promises notwithstanding and Macron's promises notwithstanding. He can't do this without America, whatever this is. And this isn't going to be what he wants exactly. And Russia's going to get some things that he doesn't want them to get. But he doesn't have a choice. And the American people, I still contend, voted for this approach. And it's not really about whether you like it or not. It's about the reality on the ground.
I hear you. I think that you're right to say that what's happening here is much bigger than Zelensky's attire. It's much bigger than who yelled what in the Oval Office. I agree with that. I think Trump, in a very deliberate way, is positioning America as a neutral arbiter of a conflict that for a long time America was on one side of. And I think there's a kind of, it's an overused word, but almost like trauma to that. There's a sense of we're no longer on Ukraine's side, and that is a real shift from where we were in our posture and rhetoric. So I think that definitely is in play. I think at the biggest level of geopolitics, or I think one of the better arguments for Trump's reorientation is to say, this idea of driving a wedge between Russia and China, and that sort of if America can kind of gather in Russia a little bit closer, you isolate China. Sort of get that, but I was uneasy at the whole spectacle. I don't, for me, it's not so much assigning blame. It wasn't a great look for the world superpower, and the Russia philia makes me nervous. I worry a little bit that we're forgetting kind of what a bad actor Russia is.
Yeah.
If they were, I don't know. I think of Navalny. I think of the war crimes in Ukraine. I think of still the gulags. If I wanted to, I could fly to Kiev tomorrow and write for the Sun. If I flew to Moscow tomorrow, you'd never hear from me again. And I know maybe those melt away in the hard light of realpolitik, but it's still jarring, I think, for people to see America pursue a sort of an amoral posture here, right? Or a neutral posture. What word would you use?
I don't know if I use either word. What I see is an American public that also knows the name of Gonzalo Lira, that also knows that we've sent whatever the number is, $350 billion or $180 billion to Ukraine, and the Ukrainian president out loud admitted that he doesn't know where half of it is, and there are a lot of rumors about where it's gone. And I see the Orthodox Church being closed and all that. And it's not to equate, it's to say in life there aren't always white hats and black hats so distinctly. There could be a black hat in Russia, and there could be like a dark gray hat in Ukraine. And I think people have started to view it that way, right or wrong. I don't think it's Russophilia, although I love that word. I'm going to steal it. I think
Slavophilia, maybe.
Slavophilia. I think President Trump has no philia for either side. I think he has a philia for critical minerals and a big economic deal. I think he has a philia for pulling, Russia away from China. He's not an ideologue, I don't think. And so for him, in his mind, this is a very practical approach. I think Zelensky's getting a security guarantee from the United States that doesn't look like a traditional security guarantee, but it still is one. And I just think I don't know what more we could offer him. More money until, as Biden used to say, until. And the question was always until what or when. And I don't think
I'm just
we've
curious,
answered
why is there no pressure on Russia?
Sentence.
When is that like act two of this? Will that happen? Or is the idea that we have more leverage over Zelensky so we can exert that? I'm sort of missing the other half of.
Well, it's a fair question.
Equation,
I think that is what a lot of people are asking. I don't know the answer to it, but I do know that we're not paying Russia's bills and we're paying the Ukraine's bills, which is why we're having these conversations with him in this way that seems so uneven. I don't know. Let's hope that Russia's not going to view this as the greatest win of their lives. I'm sure they'll position it that way, but I think we all have to be less worried about the impression of does it look good for Russia? I think we should worry about that. We don't want to offer them a win, even optically. But Ukraine didn't win the war. They didn't win. They can't win. Russia didn't win either. But where is this going to end? Are we just supposed to keep doing this?
I hear you. I think that, though, if you had said to someone before the war, listen, in 3 years, Russia won't have taken Ukraine. They won't have, you'd say Ukraine's done pretty well, all in all.
Absolutely agree. But they haven't won because there's no such thing as winning against Russia. What would a win even look like? And so without that in mind, you don't go into war without a way to finish it. There is no way to finish this that anybody has articulated.
Right.
Maybe I'm missing something.
Yeah. Wars are tough to win, though.
Yeah.
They're tough to know when they're over. I mean, even in Israel, I mean, for a long time, Israel's goal was the destruction of Hamas. I mean, that clearly hasn't happened either. So,
Right.
how do you?
And there Trump is, his administration negotiating with Hamas.
Right. So, I agree with you on the sense that we're closer to the end than the beginning. Obviously, we're kind of at the 10-yard line of this, and maybe it's a little bit like very 90s of me. It's like America, leader of the free world, leading, the sort of scrappy democracy. I get all that. I get that can all be sentimental, but I think how you do these things matter. And, I just...
Poor Zelensky.
It's more the fact that I think America in a lot of ways did vote for Trump to do a lot of these things. The question is, how far did that mandate go? And we're sort of back to style and substance. I don't know if the proof will be in the pudding, I guess. I mean, that's and I want to be fair. I mean, Trump's been president for 2 months, right? So I think we do have to reserve a little bit of judgment. You've already seen, the sort of behind the scenes, obviously shuffling with Ukraine and saying, this, I regret, I didn't regret, whatever. Yeah. So this is obviously a fluid and dynamic situation.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about Hamas and Shalom Hamas, which is what
Hello,
Trump posted on Truth Social, which of course everybody would remember. I hope that Bill Clinton said Shalom Chaver, Shalom friend to Yitzhak Rabin at his funeral. And Trump said, Shalom in Hebrew could mean either, hello or goodbye, peace or, or not. So, and he was saying to Hamas sort of tongue in cheek, it's up to you. Nobody imagines that Hamas would ever choose peace. That's not what they exist to do. Yeah. But what do you make of these negotiations?
Well, it was really a head-spinning day. First the news broke that Trump, America is negotiating directly with Hamas. We don't really know what that means, but it seemed to mark a shift. Reading some of the Israeli media, Israeli reports, it didn't seem like Israel was thrilled about it. They did say they were clued in. It didn't feel exactly like 3 cheers for it. Obviously, Trump is, I think, trying to apply this kind of pressure diplomacy that he's applied to Ukraine in some way to Hamas. But then we had this sort of stunning tableau of the hostages in the Oval Office and this remarkable tweet that basically sort of reiterated his plans for Gaza. Reiterated that he's supplied Israel, to the hilt, and said basically we've arrived at a moment of choosing. So I really don't know what's going to happen. Yeah. I don't really have a sense of where things are. I think Israel at this point is focused on getting as many hostages back as possible. But the bigger question of what comes next is just a total mystery to me.
Nobody knows.
Right?
And,
is there an appetite for restarting the war in full force? I don't know. Trump keeps saying maybe Israel should do it. I don't know. I'm not sure. Are people going to really be starting to relocate out of Gaza? I don't know. I
don't know. That scene in the Oval Office with the hostages was something, and there was such a beautiful moment at the end where he shook. I think it was Ben Ami's hand at the end, but I might be misremembering which young man he spoke to. And he looked him in the eye, shook his hand, and said, "You have a bright future ahead of you." Like Trump or hate him, I think in those moments, he actually really does shine. He feels things and he wishes people well, and he wants to see people and our country restored and redeemed and grow and be better. And when he said that to that one young man, it really moved me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and seeing Noam Argami and some of the hostages who've lost everything, and there's some thinking in the sort of world of armchair some Trump psychologists that that meeting with the hostages led directly to that tweet. That some
may
that,
have
and some of the images that they presented him with, and the stories they told.
Yes.
So I think.
Well, if that wouldn't move you, I don't know what would.
Of course. But the reality is, I think that Hamas is obviously much degraded. I don't think they're capable of pursuing another sort of October 7th, though. But they're still there. I mean, we've seen that from these, ghoulish hostage turnover ceremonies.
Yes.
And so there is a little bit of a question, or a big question, about next steps. The Arab countries proposed, a plan that was sort of a non-starter. At least it was, maybe Trump is moving the Overton window a little bit, and that people are saying, like, we can't just go back to what was there before.
I was worried we're going to get through a whole podcast without saying Overton window, but you saved us in the end. Well done.
Okay, our final segment, Rebecca, is Sunburn, where we pick something that maybe burned us or that we want to burn this week. So go ahead.
Well, I was complaining to you before the show that I had too many, and I almost don't feel excited about any of them because they are all equally irritating. So I'm just randomly picking Macron in France because the French deserve a little burn, I guess, sometimes. Who this week said that he would send French troops to the Ukraine, which would, of course, trigger this whole NATO question and America's responsibilities if any French troops were harmed. And then even went to the extent of talking about helping with a nuclear umbrella. They're one of the two nuclear countries in Europe, and providing that as protection for the Ukraine. And don't say nuclear. Not at this moment. Don't do that. Maybe at any moment, but not at this moment. And, Macron was chummy with Trump in the White House not too long ago, and then he went home and sort of did this, and I thought it was a bad look, and he should come in from the sun. He might have like heat stroke. I don't think that was a rational response.
Yeah. I mean, I will say, is that, this was, America is charting a different course than Europe now. And that'll be a story we'll keep watching.
It's so interesting. We've talked about that a little bit, but we're really on different paths.
We're on really different paths. And I think that is one of the big geopolitical stories, especially if we start to see European troops in Ukraine. I mean, that's a remarkable sort of divergence and situation. At the same time, though, we've also seen and talked about it, the way in which European politics maybe is moving closer to American politics, whether it's through right-wing populism or Elon Musk's involvement, all of that.
Right.
So,
Maloney in Italy famously said, no, I'm not, no nuclear, no troops, no. Right. So, there's that element, too.
I mean, I feel like I talk about this too much, but, my burn is the situation at Barnard, and I just I'm appalled by the behavior. I'm appalled by the timidity of the administration. The nature of the flyers that were distributed were egregious. Celebrating October 7th, celebrating Sinwar, celebrating Khania, and all these other characters. And where I come back and to it is that this isn't a free speech issue. This is a rules and behavior issue, and students could not get into the library. They could not study. Classes were disrupted. So enough. Crackdown. I don't buy this argument that these are teenagers, or even you're seeing now that these are just girls being manhandled by the police, sort of using gender. Forget about all that. They're breaking the law. And we've started to see expulsions. And again, this isn't about speech. This is about behavior and whether these campuses will really continue to exist in the way that they have.
Sadly, I feel like your Sunburn might be Barnard every week for the next year or so, because I don't see signs that they are interested in changing much, and the change will have to come from the outside.
We're starting to see that. We're starting to see Department of Justice mobilizing to investigate anti-Semitism. We're starting to see threats of withholding federal funding, and more of that, please.
Great.
Thanks, Rebecca.
Thanks, Harry.
See you next week.